Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Sophia Herrera, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, an official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will also be made available on our YouTube channel. You can access all of those videos of past programs by visiting that YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will also have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and just ask one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to all please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. I am so excited for this program tonight. I have been just anticipating it and really enjoyed working with Allie to develop this evening's program based on a really important project that happens in Kansas every year since 2009. I'm going to get that right. So we're so glad you're here in the audience with us this evening to join us for Kansas Speaks, the Crossroads of Policy and Public Opinion. I want to recognize two important people in the audience this evening. Director of the Docking Institute at Hoheisel State University, Ben Zollinger, and his colleague, Assistant Director of the Docking Institute, Jan Sun. And those two are co-authors of the survey that we're going to be speaking about this evening. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to remind students in the audience that we have some internships that are available, and you can apply for those before April 1st, the Lacey Internship Assistance Program, and additionally, a couple of awards this spring, the Robert J. Dole Service to Country and Elizabeth Dole Public Service Award. Please check out our website and apply for those awards. Tomorrow, we have another program, the last in our discussion group series for this spring, featuring our Dole Fellow Karen Wiley, for the fourth and final program of our spring 2024 discussion group series, Obstacles and Opportunities Tackling Sustainability in Kansas. Lastly, for the Easter holiday this Saturday, we will hold our annual Easter egg roll with Dole here at the Dole Institute between 10 and 1 o'clock. The Dole Institute is such a special place for community of all ages, whether they're K through 12 students, young people, University of Kansas students, community members. It's just really wonderful to bring you all together, and this week is just one of those exceptional weeks of the spring semester. It's my pleasure now to turn the floor over to our Student Advisory Board Coordinator, Allie Haggar, who again conceptualized this program, invited the guest, and brought this wonderful panel together. She's going to be our host for the conversation this evening. Please join me in welcoming Allie Haggar.
Thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'll start by introducing our guests. So firstly, we have Dr. Alexandra Middlewood, who is the Political Science Department Chair at Wichita State University. Her areas of expertise include public opinion, political behavior, gun politics, and gender. She is a contributing columnist for Insight Kansas, a policy fellow at the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Hoheisel State University, and contributes to the annual Kansas Speaks Public Opinion Survey. And she's the former president of the Great Plains Political Science Association, and she earned her PhD right here in political science at KU in 2019. Next, we have Representative Christina Haswood, who is a Democratic state legislator for the Kansas State House of Representatives. She represents Lawrence, and she's a ranking minority member on the Joint Committee State and Tribal Relations. She is known for her Native American and public health policy expertise, and Christina helped pass Kansas's first missing and murdered Indigenous peoples bill in 2021 and is an avid champion of reproductive rights. Christina is known for using social media and politics and building her bench for young Kansans to be involved in state politics. Similarly, Representative Nick Hoheisel from Wichita is a Republican member of the state representatives from the 97th District and was elected in November of 2018. He assumed office in 2019, and he is the co-chair of the Kansas Future Caucus, which Representative Haswood is also part of. So just to begin, your background. So can you tell me a little bit about how you got into your field and what made you interested in politics? So I'll pose this to all three of you. Whoever wants to start.
So I got my PhD right here at KU, and then I made the short jump to Wichita State, where I was approached to be a policy fellow at Docking Institute because of my expertise in public opinion. And that means that I get to contribute questions to the survey, which is one of my favorite things that I get to do in my role. And so I've been interested in politics since the 2000 election. That's the first election I remember. And so I have just been interested ever since then.
My journey started, I think when I was at grad school at KU Med. I was really interested in how to take health policy, and I was learning more on Native American suicide ideations in adolescents and tobacco. Electronic nicotine delivery systems was one of my dissertations in my master's program at KU Med. And I was just really frustrated that I did all this research, I did all this data, I wrote the paper, I presented academic posters, right? But who is looking at this data? And every time I look at Native American health policy data, it was always tied back to congressional dollars for funding because we have a political status with the United States government and a relationship with Congress and our tribal nations. But also in that same fold, I'm also, a citizen here in Kansas. So there's a lot of elections that I'm a part of, and that impacts my life, where I see healthcare services at Indian Health Service, which is a federally funded services as well. And it seems like every issue and roadblock kind of turned back to either a historic event that happened maybe 20, 30, 100 years ago that has created this historical trauma for that health issue, or it would be a program funded at Indian Health Services, or maybe a Native American Indian Health Service hospital, which we don't have here in Lawrence. So I felt like my research to that direction, I was just really frustrated that it needed policy change, but I didn't know how to do it. I thought I was signing up for Representative or Congresswoman Sharice Davis's campaign, but it ended up being a voter registration drive out in Wyandotte County. So one day after school, I went over to Wyandotte County and got folks registered to vote. Quickly realized that I was one of very few people of color working and volunteering in a marginalized minority population, and I got the most signatures that day. This is back before we passed legislation that made it a little bit harder to get folks registered to vote, and that really opened my eyes to how Kansas politics does not have that representation, or no folks who might have that privilege to have a background that or look like me be in politics, because I feel like it is a privilege to be that heavily involved. And just got really curious and ended up finding our first Native American female legislator, former State Representative Ponkwea Victor's Cozad. I connected with her. She introduced that missing more Indigenous Peoples bill back in like 2020. I missed class one morning to go to the other way of the 70, shook her hand and said, "How can I help?" And pretty soon she had someone call me to ask me to run for office. So I guess that was the way that I could help, and that's kind of how I started.
So my first political memory is actually voting in a fake election in elementary school, 92 for Ross Perot for president. This is your America too. I still remember his tagline. And then 4 years later, had the opportunity another mock election to vote for Bob Dole, and it's an honor to be here tonight and get to speak at the Dole Center. Beautiful complex here. But then I kind of went off and on in politics. I went to Wichita State, studied poli-sci at Wichita State for a while. And during the 2010s, there were a lot of choices that were made on the state level I didn't necessarily agree with. especially on tax policy and education. And I was a member of my neighborhood association board. I was a member of my city council district advisory board in Wichita. And in 2018, my predecessor retired. He was in his 70s, and I was approached by a group of individuals from the district asking me to consider running. They thought I'd be good for this spot. I was 31 at the time, and I went home and talked to my wife and said, hey, some folks want me to do this. Give me your thoughts. I'm pretty sure she thought I was just going to lose. So she said, go ahead, have fun. I was outspent 3-1 in my primary against another gentleman that was 70 years old. His name was Michael Walker, very nice gentleman, but he was a little further to the right than I was, and I disagreed with a few of his policy positions. Again, he outspent me 3-1. I went out and just knocked a ton of doors, and I beat him. I won by 8 points. Had a general election against a very nice lady, a Democrat named Becky Jenick. Her and I are great friends now, and I beat her by 15 points. And I think then my wife was like, oh crap, like, what are we gonna do now? You actually won. So we had to figure that out after. But it was about making sure, our kids, I'm a product of public education. My kids are products of public education. They're in the public education system now down in Wichita. And funding schools, restoring fiscal responsibility to the state were huge issues. I mean, there were a lot of decisions, and I'm a fiscal conservative, but there wasn't really many fiscally conservative positions that were being taken during the 2010s here in Kansas. So that was something that really, really got me energized to run for office and make a difference.
Thank you. So I'll start with Dr. Middlewood. So you talked a little bit about your role in the Kansas Speaks Public Opinion Survey. Can you tell us just a little bit more about it, what it is, and if there were any surprises you found when conducting the survey?
Yeah, so Kansas Speaks is a public opinion survey that is conducted out of the Docking Institute at Hoheisel State University. I like to say it's the only survey run for Kansans by Kansans, and it's the only regular public opinion survey in the state as well. So every fall, we distribute a questionnaire. Since 2020, we've done an online survey. So before then, we used phone calls, but people don't like to answer their phones anymore. So we switched to online in 2020. And we have a host of different questions, everything from the state of the economy to social issues, to people, we ask people if they think that their lives are better now than they were 5 years ago, all sorts of questions like that. And the real goal is to know what Kansans are thinking about these policy issues, in hopes that our state legislature and other elected officials across the state will use that data to inform policy making. And so it's essentially public scholarship is a one way to put that. So in last year's survey, we had 477 Kansans that took the survey, which is considered representative of the entire state. We use a random sample, though it's random-ish is what I like to say, because we do select based on geographic area, so we try to have an equal balance of rural and urban respondents, also by gender and by age, so we can have as representative a sample as possible. And so that way we know what Kansans are actually thinking about these issues as they show up in our survey.
So as Dr. Middlewood said, polls like these are conducted to help lawmakers like you. So as a lawmaker, what were some of your takeaways from this survey, and how can you integrate this into your legislative decision-making process?
Yeah, I was looking at the survey and found really great results. I think one of my favorite sections was, as a young person, reading about how other folks felt like staying in Kansas. Are they happy in Kansas? Do they feel like they're gonna move within Kansas or move outside of Kansas? Being a legislator here in Lawrence with KU here and our wonderful institutions across the state, we lose a lot of that young talent, and either to that affordable housing piece, which I saw that was covered in the survey, or child planning and taxes that were mentioned, were all going through my head when I was reading these results, and how can we make Kansas more of that appealing to stay here, to plant roots here, and to grow a family here, and to have a better future for our state and for a diversity of folks. And just reflecting as a legislator, this is a week where we are on the floor all day, and we saw a lot of bills in the past couple months, and we'll see a lot this week. But looking at some of this legislation and reflecting that some of them don't really represent what we're seeing in the results of the data, and thinking, how can we get there? How can we, what kind of amendments can we make? Or is this just a totally bad idea and we have to start all over? And what do those look like? What do those conversations look like? But this is my 4th year in the legislature, so it's a lot of learning and realizing that really good legislation can take years, can take decades, and a lot of trial and error. So having respect for that process too has been really eye-opening.
Yeah, I always appreciate the Kansas Speak poll. I'm big on polling and data. I've worked on a lot of campaigns, intersect with a lot of data and polling internally. One of the, as I was appreciative of the housing components that were asked in this. I chair the Financial Institutions and Pensions Committee in the House, and one of the things that run through my committee is housing, and we've passed some housing legislation in the last few years. Just a few weeks ago, we did a whole day of housing presentations on housing strategies that other states have incorporated, including Oregon, who just recently passed a massive sweeping zoning reform bill statewide. It was a statewide one. So we actually had a senator from Oregon zoom in to the committee and testify about what they did there and what they're seeing. So I'm always appreciative of that. I will say, though, the one small pushback I will have, and it's not with the actual polling, the marijuana question for legalization of marijuana. I am a big advocate of marijuana reform. Christina will probably tell you, within my caucus, I'm probably one of the biggest, very loud about it. I cautioned when this results came out about the nearly, we'll just call it 70% of Kansans are in favor of legalizing marijuana for taxing purposes. I view that question as more of a taxing question than a legalization of marijuana question. Now, what I caution with, and I got interviewed in Wichita by a couple of news organizations about this, because they know if it's something's on marijuana, they can always get a comment from me, that I don't believe that's the case, that 70% of Kansans are in favor of legalizing marijuana. I don't believe that. I have not seen one other poll internally from working on campaigns, one other poll other than the Kansas Speak one that says 70% of Kansans are in favor of legalizing marijuana. The highest I've seen on medical marijuana is 61, 62%. And legalization, I've always seen it. It's getting better. It's still maybe a little bit underwater, but it may be at about 50%. But the news media takes this, and without adding that piece for taxing purposes, just blasts out a headline, 70% of Kansans are in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana. And what that does when we're trying to pass something like medical marijuana in the state legislature, and we're trying to get, we'll call them fence sitters, votes of individuals who may be okay with medical marijuana, do not want recreational, and do feel that medical is a gateway to recreational. And when they see that, that scares those votes that we need to pass medical marijuana in Kansas off, because they say, oh, 7%, you guys are just going to come back and ask for recreational marijuana next. So I caution on that one. And it's not so much the question and how it was phrased, it was what the media did with the answer. When they blast and say 70% of Kansans are in favor of medical marijuana, not adding the taxing component on the end of it. Because again, I view that as a taxing question. So it's all about basically how you ask the questions, how you interpret it. But I enjoy these. You get a lot of feedback about how constituents feel and how Kansans in general feel about a lot of topics.
So, well, data like this surveys the whole state. How do you survey your own constituents, and how does that inform your decision-making process?
I can go first.
Yeah.
So I show up to all the events that I'm invited to or I try to. And I am lucky to have been born and raised here in Lawrence, so I can tap into my old teachers, where I've volunteered in classrooms at like Billy Mills Middle School, did reading nights at Prairie Park Elementary School, my previous elementary school, and get to speak to some KU classes, speak to Lawrence High classes. I did about 3 class periods in one day and lost my voice, so it's such a very hard profession to do. And I get the privilege to go to Haskell, where I got my associates, and speak there and share my story, and try and get everywhere I can, from community events to speaking to students, and really trying to meet folks where they're at. I wouldn't say I was really politically involved before getting into politics. So I try to remember back where, I felt like I did not have that representation or voice in my government, and how it was just such a daunting experience to figure out who your legislator was. And it took me a while to figure out, oh, we have a city commission, we have a county commission, what do they do? Because before I knew all this political knowledge, you would just look around and be like, why is everyone saying that property taxes are so high? I'm a renter. What does that mean for me? Oh, that means like rent's increasing. So how that problem impacts me. But yeah, and then social media too. So I ran during COVID times, where we were wanting to be respectful of folks' distance and physical distancing. So we really utilized social media as much as we could. I ran a shoestring and gum budget, as well as Representative Hoheisel in his first race. So social media is one of the most cost-effective ways to communicate with folks in your community. But little did we know, that communication does not only stay in your community, it can go across the state, across the country, and across the world, and sharing the story that can inspire others to get more civically engaged.
Yeah, and I would definitely recommend checking out Representative Haswood's TikTok. It's an interesting time. So I communicate, social media posts, a ton of that, stuff like that. I've surveyed before. I've actually done polling in my district. However, a district of 24,000, it's hard to get an actual sample size there. But it is. It's feedback. It's data that I can use. It may not be exactly accurate, but it's feedback. I love getting constituent feedback, emails, social media posts, social media messages, tweets. If anybody follows me on Twitter, it's an interesting experience. One caveat about my Twitter account is you have to realize that Twitter is not a real place. So you go on Twitter, you just have fun. It's not a real place. It's fine. But I love engaging on Twitter. I actually gave it up for Lent. So Sunday, I get my Twitter account back. And it's actually been pretty peaceful. I thought it was going to be, and it was hard at the beginning. There were a lot of things I wanted to tweet back to my Republican colleagues and stuff, but I just couldn't. And Jesus, I think, is satisfied with that, I hope, because he knows how bad I want it to. And I have some bangers that are ready for Monday. It's going to be bad. But anytime a constituent calls me, the thing I love doing most is a constituent will call me during the week, and they'll leave a message for my assistant, and I will actually look them up, get their address, and I'll actually just show up during the weekend on their doorstep. Be like, hey, Representative Hoheisel, call me Nick, please. I hate being called representative. You called my office last week about this. I just want to talk to you in person about it. Showing up at the doorstep, and they really appreciate that. Like, you made time to come out here. Just yeah, absolutely. I like doing that stuff. I like having face-to-face conversations. And it could be people that are pissed off at me, too. I have people calling up pissed off at me, and hey, let's go to have a cup of coffee. Let's just discuss this together. Those interactions, too. But, yeah, a ton of community outreach just to get that feedback, especially in the off session, so when we come back in January, we're armed with all that information.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into more specific policy questions, you guys are both members of the Kansas Future Caucus. So what role do you see in that caucus in promoting youth engagement and bipartisan cooperation policymaking?
So I was really excited that we had this thing called Future Caucus in our state legislature. Not every state has one, so we're really lucky that we had folks. Were you part of the creation of it?
No, so they had a future caucus before I got there, and then it kind of died off. And then when I got elected with Representative Woodard and Chu, we kind of brought it back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it was in the last maybe 10 or 15 years that it was created and just revitalized. And I remember in my first term, we have a generational gap in the legislature. There is an age gap in the legislature. And to find the folks who are around your age group, we can talk about, really similar life events that really bond us together.
A lot of conversations about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, we'll say that. A lot of thoughts on that one.
Yes, but then Representative Anderson came,
Yeah.
and so we had one Gen Z and millennials. So I think that was part of Future Caucus's rebranding. But I got excited because they did this Google Forms survey, and I was looking at the questions, and I was like, climate change, yes. Housing, yes. And then like guns, yes. Like these are issues that we want to focus on and get into, where I feel like there's really not that space for learning, for talking about someone like me who doesn't have kids, but I come from a community where our schools are closing. What can we do better with childcare? I'm a renter, so what can we do better about affordable housing? Because for me to own a house right now is pretty much a joke with my student loan debt. So I'm like, okay, these are real things that maybe my colleagues who are 60 and 70 are not facing right now. And it's been their experiences are a lot different than what we're dealing with in a younger generation. So I just felt really welcomed that we were talking about issues that particularly pertain to me in my everyday life.
Yeah, so the Future Caucus it's a caucus of lawmakers under 45 years old. And it's bipartisan. And our caucus, since I've been up there, it's actually grown every year, which is a really great thing for a more representative Kansas. Our first year, we sent out a Survey Monkeys just asking policy questions of what can we work on together in a bipartisan way. And we took those results and we filtered them out, and housing was the one we found we agreed on the most. In a bipartisan thing, we're never really going to agree on guns. We're never really going to agree on taxes. We're never really going to agree on abortion. We're always going to have those kind of fundamental disagreements, although there is some policy overlap. But housing was the one that we found we were all in agreement on, that there was something we could address. So what we did is we took that information and we created the first-time homebuyers savings account. And we passed this into law to give first-time homebuyers a savings account, tax-free savings account of up to $50,000 that they can contribute into, or folks can contribute into for them and receive a tax credit in order to help them buy their first home, for down payment and stuff on their first home. And we were actually to work on this legislation, sponsor it, pass it into law, and it is now Kansas law. So that was a good start for the Kansas Future Caucus, again, finding that one policy that we all can agree on. And we also throw in a bunch of events, just bipartisan events where, there's nobody from the outside in there, and you're in regular clothes, you're not in a suit and tie, and you're outside of that Capitol building. And you're just in a casual atmosphere, and you're talking about, pop stars or movies and stuff like that. And then you might have a drink or two, and you actually get into actual serious policy debate. Some of my best friends are in the Future Caucus, and they're Democrats, and there's things I don't know, especially Representative Woodard, who's the first openly gay representative in Kansas history. And I can have honest and frank and private conversations with him where he doesn't feel offended if I'm asking these questions because I'm curious. And it's just those atmospheres that you get comfortable with folks, and you can talk about actual policy without having your guards up or thinking that, oh, this is a gotcha moment or a gotcha question that they're going to use against you in the next election. So that is one of the huge benefits to the Future Caucus, is we trust each other in there to have those frank and hard conversations without taking offense.
So I'll direct this question at Dr. Middlewood, but if you guys want to jump in at any time, feel free. So many people's main takeaway from the survey was the overwhelming support for Medicaid expansion, nearly 70%. And this has also become a primary policy goal for Governor Kelly. So in what ways do you believe this data has contributed to the momentum besides Medicaid expansion in Kansas?
Yeah, so Medicaid expansion is a difficult one because there is bipartisan support for it, but there's also politics at play, right? So Republicans voting for it under a Democratic governor gives the Democratic governor a win and vice versa. And so that makes it a really complicated policy to get passed. But there are things that people can agree on that maybe aren't full Medicaid expansion, but that these questions allow us to extrapolate from, that maybe we can't pass Medicaid expansion, but what else can we agree on and do in terms of public health care and providing health care to people who can't afford it on their own. The big one that I take out of this survey is not just the expansion, but how important people realize Medicaid expansion is to rural hospitals staying open in Kansas. So pretty much the last 2 years, we've had about 60% of rural hospitals that are at risk of closing. And one of the only ways to keep them open is to raise taxes to pay for it or to expand Medicaid. And that has allowed various policymakers, also various researchers, kind of different ways to look into this question and see if we can't pass Medicaid, what can we do because there is such high support for it? And that support is bipartisan. So when we look at expanding Medicaid as a whole, there is a majority support among Democrats, independents, and Republicans, is what the survey shows. There's also more support among women, those with a high school diploma or equivalent, those who have lower income, and people who are not white as well. And so we know this is a really important issue to lots of different groups in Kansas, and we can hope, looking to you two now, that the legislature can do something to pass this policy that so many Kansans support and need and would benefit from, especially in our rural areas. But we know that because of this survey. Was there a second part to your question? Was that all?
No, yeah, that
Okay.
was good. So going on to the next thing, the survey also showed the majority of respondents support women's reproductive autonomy. Nevertheless, this is still a very controversial topic. So what does the abortion debate look like in Kansas today?
To me? Or?
Yeah, you can answer. Anyone can answer it.
Okay.
Looking at you, so.
Okay. So as we know, the abortion amendment that was on the ballot in 2022 passed with overwhelming support. One of the most interesting things that I think to come out of Kansas survey in the last Kansas Speaks. Failed. Yes, no, you're right. To uphold abortion rights in Kansas. So it failed with overwhelming support, I guess you could say. But the most interesting finding in Kansas Speaks in recent years is if you look at the 2021 Kansas Speaks survey, the number of people who specifically answered the question, women are in a better position than politicians to make their own choices in regards to abortion, predicted that outcome in that amendment almost perfectly. So we saw about the same number of people said, yes, women are in a better place to make that decision than politicians, and then voted no on that amendment. So that's one of the things that has surprised me the most out of this survey. But we don't get into this too much in this most recent survey, but in past surveys, we've asked a lot more questions about the nuances around abortion access, and it really shows how conflicted Kansans are about that issue and how many different ways there are to interpret what abortion access means. And the data shows that, especially from that 2021 survey, I believe is where all of those questions are, and shows how conflicted Kansans are. And so we know that a majority don't want the government to be able to ban it outright, because we see that from that amendment. But when it comes to different aspects of abortion access, it's a lot more complicated than that, and our surveys show us that.
So I'll direct this one at Representative Haswood. So climate change is a critical concern for many young people. Were there any insights you were able to draw about that topic from this survey, or are there any bipartisan efforts to address this issue?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of the clean energy section as well, and having Kansans really think through those questions of solar and wind energy. So if I'm correct, 65% said solar and wind energy resources were important or extremely important. And we are seeing some legislation that might not align with that. But I feel like here in Kansas, we could do a lot more. And it's just unfortunate that that's not maybe the attitude of the majority in leadership to take advantage of renewable resources here. And I feel like coming from Lawrence, we're always under a microscope of what we do. Sometimes we do something good. And there's legislation the next session to ban local governments from passing similar regulations statewide. So it's always interesting coming from a community that's very open to renewable energies and celebrates ways that we can do better to protect the environment, but going to work at Topeka and working with colleagues all across our state who might not hold those similar values, which leads me to the next finding in the survey that I found really interesting was that 62.1% thought that Kansas farmers should make changes to agricultural practices to conserve water. So Kansas water is a big topic in the legislature, and I feel like that has a lot of bipartisan support on either funding it from the state level, but also looking at legislation. And we have really good leadership on our House water team. I don't think the Senate has a dedicated water committee, so a lot of that goes to their agricultural committee. But we have like Representative Jim Minix and Representative Lindsey Vaughn, who is, I believe, our youngest woman in the state House, and they are just like an awesome team going all over Kansas. Representative Minix is a farmer himself, and Representative Vaughn is from Johnson County. So you can imagine, bringing those different backgrounds together, what really great legislation that we get to see come through the House. So it's really exciting. And I was on Agriculture Committee my first term and got to travel out to Western Kansas and see, rivers unfortunately drying up within people's lifetimes. And outside of legislative work, I work 2 other jobs. And one of them is looking at Iowa tribes of Kansas and Nebraska, and they're doing regenerative agriculture and how to decolonize their agricultural practices and how to have that indigenous knowledge of the land and the soil and 3 sister plants. How are they doing that within a cultural lens? And it's really neat to see tribes just really take back that agricultural practice, that holistic, that respect for the environment and Mother Earth, and say, this is what we're going to do, and look at it, it's actually working. And I feel like mainstream title is regenerative agriculture, but a lot of it was just tribal, cultural, and knowledge, and just getting that back and teaching their tribal members and the future generation.
So Representative Hoheisel, the survey indicated a positive shift in Kansans' perspective of the state's economy. How do you, if any, has this sentiment driven economic policy initiatives?
I think, just my feedback from my constituents is inflation is still a problem with them. Economic uncertainties, right? I will say the thing I was satisfied most with this Kansas Speak poll was to find that the legislator is still slightly more popular in Kansas than Joe Biden is. And that's by a point, 1.2 or 1.3, but a win's a win. It's all here. But no, it's good to see that people are more optimistic with our economy and what's in store for the future. There's been talk for the last 18 months, is this going to be a hard landing? Is it going to be a soft landing? Are we going to hit a recession? My brother, who's a Democrat, who's actually on the city council in Wichita, he texts me once every few weeks, still waiting for that recession. When's it going to come? You've been talking about it for a year and a half now. But it's good to see that folks are somewhat optimistic. There have been some gloomy days, especially through COVID, on the economic uncertainty, especially here in Kansas and abroad. but it's a positive step. So as far as how does that influence policy on the state level, I'm not exactly sure it has. Now, if I could, I'd like to go back to the Medicaid expansion, just to expunge on that real quick, because there is a piece here that does link. While Medicaid expansion may not be happening this year, the piece about rural hospitals struggling is a true piece, and that is something that we've been trying to figure out. One solution that we have is Medicaid reimbursement rates. And right now we are looking at how to increase Medicaid reimbursement rates. One thing with Medicaid expansion, it does take a portion of folks off the exchange, the insurance exchange, and it puts them on CanCare. And that gives them the Medicaid reimbursement rates that actually pay lower than the rates insurance companies pay rural hospitals. So in a way, it actually takes a hit. Now, granted, yes, there are a lot of uninsured folks that use hospitals, and the hospitals don't collect on that. But the Medicaid reimbursement rates are also a problem with these rural hospitals, and we're looking at, and you may see something pop up here pretty quickly on raising those Medicaid rates to help out rural hospitals. So that is one piece that we're aware of. It's indicated in the survey, but how to help those struggling rural hospitals survive. So there's one piece on that one as well.
So I'll direct this next one at both of our representatives. So there were also concerns about election fraud raised by respondents, with just only like a little more than half of them believing that the winners of the Kansas elections were the actual people who got the most votes, which was a significant dip from the previous year. So how do you see the legislature's role in addressing this perception of fraud without creating more obstacles in the voting process?
Yeah, so I don't think, are you on elections
I
committee?
am not. No,
So we're learning together.
yeah.
So I read a couple of news articles as well saying that I believe the percentage did increase about election security. And with that, coming from a Democrat, we have a really good Secretary of State, Secretary Scott Schwab, who has testified, I believe, in the Elections Committee saying, we're doing our best. And as a Democrat and he's a Republican, I feel like that's a line that we can respect. And here in Lawrence and Douglas County, we're really grateful to have a great election officer, Jeannie Shu, who's one of the best in the state. So, hearing this election fraud, I feel like a lot of it is ingrained in a bit of truth, a bit of maybe miscommunication or confusion, and hearing stories from my colleagues across the aisle saying their constituent has, received multiple ballots. That might be a concern that, people have that experience of, and I think that the legislature should make sure that we have all our I's dotted and our T's crossed to make sure that Kansans feel secure in our elections. And I think, looking more into how we make elections more accessible, I was surprised to see in the survey results that a majority of folks did not feel like Kansas needed to, there was barriers, I believe, to voter accessibility, if I remember the question correctly. I thought that percentage would be a little bit more, but it was about maybe the 50 to 30% range, because I'm hearing coming from a college community that we want polling locations on college campuses, and ideas of like same-day voter registration. And I was surprised to not really see that enthusiasm in the polling results as well, which made me question that, what more do we need to do? I guess the focus should be on reassuring folks that we have a really good election system here, and that we're really trying to do our best.
Yeah, and I was looking at the numbers here. 54% of respondents were confident that the reported winners of the election in Kansas are actually the candidate that had the most votes. I can tell you they all were. 11% were not confident, so it's that 11%. And then when you look down at 12% of respondents agree that state and local elections officials in Kansas committed election fraud to alter election outcomes. I don't know what those 12% are thinking. I can tell you now, I worked for Derek Schmidt's governor's campaign, and I can tell you now with 100% certainty that Laura Kelly, despite my best efforts, won the election, and but so did the Republican supermajority. So I always, it's a weird thing when I ask these folks, where's the voter fraud? Like, we maintain a supermajority in the House and the Senate, when quite honestly, there was a chance we weren't going to. I mean, it was pretty close. Some of the closer elections broke our way, and we were able to hang on. So where exactly was the voter fraud? Laura Kelly was elected once; she was reelected again. But you know, as Representative Haswood said on here, only 14% of Kansans agree that the government has made it too hard to vote in Kansas elections. So it's restoring that confidence, but as Representative Haswood said, but also making sure you're not crossing that line where it is becoming a burden. You know, we do have folks that want to do away with mail ballot or mail voting, or the 3-day grace period and ballot drop boxes at the same time. And while I say, okay, if we're doing away with the 3-day grace period, which a number of other states do not have, by the way, if we're doing away with 3-day grace period, we need to keep the drop boxes, because if you have a mail ballot and it's Saturday, it's Sunday, it's Monday, we have huge mail issues in Wichita right now. I would suggest anybody, if you're doing a mail ballot, if you're not mailing it within that first week, drop it in a drop box. Do not stick it in the mail, not because I don't trust the mail service, it's because you never know with the mail. But that's why I'm like, okay, if you guys want to do away with the 3-day grace period, you have to keep the drop boxes. And that encourages people to drop these mail ballots into drop boxes, because again, quite frankly, especially in Wichita, we're having a huge mail service problem, and you never know if that ballot's going to get in. So those are some of the policy discussions we've had this year. I don't think we've seen those bills on the House floor yet. I know there's some action in the Senate. If you guys aren't aware, I despise the Senate. And this time of year, it is no longer Republican versus Democrat. It is actually House versus Senate right now. And let me tell you guys, the Senate is big mad at us for some things we're doing in the House by actually being responsible and compromising and providing leadership to Kansas. And the Senate's pretty ticked off at us right now, and we're okay with that because the Senate sucks. And there's a proposal by the current senator from this area, I won't mention her name, but to go down from 125 House districts to just 100. Or I'm sorry, 120. She wants 3 House reps to every senator, and she tries to pass this every year. And I want her to pass it, send it to us in the House, because I'm going to amend the hell out of that to abolish the Senate, and I'm going to send it right back to them. So that's how I feel about the Senate.
And if you have any other insights on the election.
I don't know how to follow that. I would just add that we talked about how only 15% of Kansans agree that government has made it too hard to vote in Kansas, which seems to mean that most people like the status quo of where we're at right now. So if we look at some of the questions about banning ballot drop boxes, banning vote by mail, abolishing early voting, none of those have high levels of support either. And so it seems to me, once again, extrapolating from this, that most Kansans kind of like where we're at. They like the current policies that we have. They don't really want to change that too much.
Okay, so before we turn it over to audience Q&A, I'll pose this to all three of you. So what steps can be taken to bridge the gap between public sentiment and legislative action for a more responsive government?
So as a political scientist and as a huge supporter of democracy, I love public opinion because it is one of the ways that citizens get to communicate with their elected officials and tell them what they think about these various issues. We know that not all citizens participate in politics other than voting, so they're not calling or writing letters, they're not attending campaigns, but maybe they're willing to take a survey that they get in their email. And so it's a really important aspect of any sort of democratic governance that elected officials know what their citizens want and what their constituents want. And that is one of the best things about Kansas Speaks, in my opinion. And that if you get a survey, here's my plea to fill it out, because it actually does make a difference, as you've heard here today.
When you asked that question, it reminded me of I tried to do town halls my first term, and no one would show up. And that actually works in Johnson County. They always have a fabulous turnout, and I'm just like, why does that not work here? Because our communities are different, because my demographic's different. We have a different way of life. We're not Johnson County. So I sat there thinking, how can I best serve my constituents? And trying to think outside the box. So we started to utilize social media with going live. And then now we're creating ideas. We had one time, we partnered with a nonprofit, this really cool KU student-led group called Lawrence Fridge in Kansas, where they used to have a fridge out on Mass Street, trying to provide that food pantry service in our community, that gap in our service. And we partnered up with Kansas Appleseed too, and we got tacos from La Estrella, and we found a park, reserved it, and it was one of my biggest attended events, talking about food insecurity and housing, and what is that intersecting with being a young person in KU and food insecurity as a college student. I remember that. And just trying to break that gap and maybe that box that in typical politics, and trying to make politics more fun. Before TikTok got a little controversial, I felt like I utilized TikTok, and that was one of the ways of how I would break down big issues, how I would showcase the behind the scenes, because I always saw it from the other side in, that, being involved in politics was like this velvet curtain, like what happens behind the scenes. And meeting folks like Nick here, it's, they're just normal folks, and a lot of dad jokes, and and getting to know your colleagues, and just, taking away that intimidation and showing that these are real folks, and we should treat each other with respect as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest thing for me is my door is literally always open. My phone is open. My email is open. A constituent contacts me, you're getting a response, no matter what. Even if it's a very mean-spirited one filled with profanity, you're going to get a very sarcastic response from me, something like thoughts and prayers or something like that. But you'll always get a response from me. Just reach out to your rep, reach out to your senator, invite them out for a cup of coffee. Even if you vehemently disagree with, even if you're a far-left socialist and they're a far-right MAGA, invite them out. Get to know them as a person. Get to know their points of view, why they think the way they think, and allow them the time to learn why you think the way you think. I think that's the biggest thing with the Future Caucus, is it gives us that opportunity to hear from each other in our backgrounds and how we grew up. Most people didn't know, me, how I grew up. I grew up in a single mom household with 5 brothers and a sister, in a 3-bedroom apartment. My older brother and sister are half white, half Italian, and my 4 younger brothers are actually half black, half white. So I come from an extremely diverse family. Again, a 3-bedroom apartment with a single mom, never had a dad in our lives at all. So a lot of times we come in and we have these preconceived notions of each other. Well, their folks on the left preconceived notion on me was I'm just a little rich, snobby, white, male, straight Republican, that just loves his guns and all that, until they got to know me and they were like, oh, actually, you've been around, you've seen these things that Democrats talk about, especially when we talk about welfare reform and stuff like that. And occasionally I vote with the other side. There's been a few welfare reform bills that have to do with SNAP benefits that have came up for votes that I voted with the other side on. I voted with the Democrats on, just because I know what that's like, and I know the end result of that. At the end result, yeah, we may think we're punishing the parent or holding the parent accountable. At the end of the day, the only one that is suffering is the child. So I have that background. So just give each other a chance and an opportunity to learn why people think the way they think. They're going to give you the same respect and the same opportunity to learn about your background and your history and why you think the way you think. And those conversation starters will lead to a better result for you both.
Okay, we'll turn it to the audience now for Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and one of the students with the microphone will come to you, and they'll hold the microphone for you when they come.
Thank you. for being here, and thank you for this conversation. This is what it's supposed to look like. People speak, legislators listen, you respond. But when the majority leaders in the House absolutely do not listen to what the people say, I'm so concerned that we'll have a greater and greater number of people just disengaging, not voting, not participating. How do we address that?
I'll go ahead and start off with this one. I think you just have to keep encouraged. I mean, we've always had, in any political process, we've always had what we conceive as people not listening, politicians not listening, because perhaps they're not doing what we specifically want them to do, or what we perceive that they should be doing. But the answer is, if you don't agree with them, vote them out. Tell your friends, get folks to the polls. I mean, that's always the answer. Politics is frustrating. It's an extremely frustrating process. I have been up there 6 years now, and when I came up there, I thought I was going to change the world. I thought I was going to go up there and put Kansas on the right path. And don't get me wrong, we are actually on a very good path now compared to where we were 6 years ago. And I'll take credit for all that as a Republican legislator. But we're on a great path, but there's always been this frustration within politics. And again, I feel it every day. There's things I've been working on for 6 years that we have not made hardly any progress on. Again, we were just talking about medical marijuana. We still haven't got that done yet. I wanted it done 6 years ago. It's high time we get medical marijuana passed in Kansas. There's a dad joke.
I heard it.
But it's a frustrating process, but you stay the course, just like our forefathers did, just like, our parents did and their parents did, and stay engaged. And, depending on your political outlook, perhaps it gets better, but don't let the frustration get to you. Always go out, always make your voice heard.
I would say, I feel like folks who feel like it's not worth getting civically engaged, it's not worth getting involved in voting, that they tell us, they shout it out, they shout it on the microphones, they write it on poster boards of, what issues that maybe the top and leadership are not listening to, or the changes that they're seeing. And I think about, I didn't even cast my first ballot. I didn't even register to vote until I was about 23, because I always thought my vote didn't matter. And it wasn't really until I saw, Congresswoman Sharice Davids, former state legislator Ponkway Victor's Cozad, now Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, folks who look like me in these positions, I was like, I could probably do that too. And they're talking about issues that other elected officials weren't. So having those voices and just that representation at the table, but also folks like in our current presidential cabinet, and I will give credit to the previous administration, they focus on Native American policies. Former President Trump actually passed some missing and murdered indigenous peoples policies, and President Biden actually had the first Native American cabinet member in the presidential cabinet in history. And just seeing that top approach and, listening to maybe, I don't know if they saw my tweet about how we need that representation, but seeing that result really fueled me and said, okay, they're listening. And how do we create that change and continue to organize? I'd say bigger in numbers too. And even that skill and that word organizing means a different bit in politics, what I'm learning. How do we change an issue and issues that we see in our community, and how do we craft it to policy? And we get folks that drop off there. I remember interning in DC and meeting like 18-year-old Native American students, and they're like, I'm so frustrated that this is how the United States government works. I'm the only Native in the Senate buildings, and talking about this and this and this. And I was like, you got to keep going. It's hard. It's really hard being one of the only in the rooms, but we need you there. And there's folks out there who unfortunately can't be here, but that is such a heavy burden to hold. So making sure you take care of yourself and your community, and your partners and your warriors in this fight is, making sure you take care of yourself too during this time, so you can get out there and be out there for your community.
I would also add that there's power in numbers, which you mentioned slightly. Elected officials listen to the people who show up most often and try to communicate with them the most and essentially are the loudest. So if you can bring, 5 or 6 or 10 people along with you, that's the best way to get the attention of elected officials. And I'd also say focus on the local level as well. So a lot of the time we think about national politics, sometimes we think about state politics, but we tend to forget about our local governments. And they're the ones that are making decisions that are actually affecting us every single day, and who are probably getting the least amount of input from their constituents. And so trying to focus on that local level is another great way. I hear from my students all the time that elected officials don't care about them and don't represent them, and then they don't want to be involved in politics, but that's a really good way to never get the change that you want, is to just disengage. And so find what works for you, find the way that you want to participate, and bring some friends along with you.
If I can follow up, just one quick extra point on this. And again, I know it's frustrating, but also don't think that we're not passing good bipartisan legislation up there. While it may not be everything you want, 90+% of the legislation we're passing up there is actually bipartisan. We're passing a lot of good things where we're compromising, we're working together. We're working between Republicans and the governor's office. The media, and this is an attack on the media, but the media needs to sell newspapers. They need headlines, and so the most exciting headlines are the headlines that we disagree with. So a lot of the good bipartisan stuff we're passing doesn't necessarily get reported as much as our disagreements, but we are passing a lot of great bipartisan legislation up there. It's on housing, on some healthcare stuff. Hopefully tomorrow we'll see how our Democratic colleagues feel, but on taxes, we have what I believe is a very good compromise tax plan that we'll be voting on in the House tomorrow. But again, these are things that we're working to compromise on. That are good. That's good legislation that's really going to be impactful to Kansas. So it's not all bad up there. It's kind of what I'm saying.
Okay, we have time for one more question right there. This one right there.
Follow-up to Dr. Middlewood's
Okay, can we get the microphone over there just so the virtual audience can hear?
Thank you, Ella. Mine's a follow-up question, actually, for Dr. Middlewood. Dr. Middlewood, you, in answer to that question, said you think there's power in numbers, and you said it's often the loudest people that get listened to by elected officials. I'm curious what you're basing that on as a fellow social scientist. I wondered if that's somehow reflected in the data collection or your personal observations, or kind of what leads you to feel and think that way.
Yeah, so the specific piece of political science scholarship that I'm referring to is called The Electoral Connection by David Mayhew. And what he says in his research on members of Congress is that they are responsive to their constituents that they hear from the most. Along with that, there are different levels of constituency. So there's the people who are voting for them, the people who are donating money to their campaigns, the people who are just living in their districts, right? And so it's based on this long line of political science research that shows that elected officials are going to be responsive to the people in their districts who are directly contacting them, who are showing up to town hall meetings, who are calling them, who are sending them letters, who are showing up to their offices. We actually have the research to support that. And I would assume that both of you have seen that and have practiced that as well. When it comes down to it, right, elected officials need to get reelected. And the best way to do that is to show their constituents that they're actually doing something that benefits them. Without that, they're just going to get voted out of office. So it is to their benefit to do so. And it is oftentimes not on these big, usually social issues that people care really strongly about, right? But it's about these small compromises. It's about these smaller policies that are actually easy to get passed through the legislature, that you can see some of those differences in what constituents want showing up.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much tonight for joining us, to our 3 guests, and thank you guys so much for coming. Just a reminder, tomorrow at 4, we have our last discussion group series of the year, so be sure to show up for that if you're interested in climate change, topics like that. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.